Well, welcome everybody to this special conversation with a couple of old guys, right? No, just kidding. So we have Phil Claycomb, the director of Nexus, church planting and leader care. Grateful for Phil to be here, and also have Robi Brust. Robi is one of our Nexus resident older church planters, more seasoned church planters, I should say. But more recently, just became the director of Arkansas Church Planting Network, ACPN. So super excited to have Robi. Robi, thanks for joining us, man.
Hey man, I'm excited to be here. This is it's a lot of fun. It's fun to talk about what old guys talk about. So it's good.
Good. So we have a special conversation we want to have around the idea of kind of that old song, like I wish that I knew what I know now when I was younger, right? Of just some of the practices that you guys have done, maybe for years, maybe leadership practices, self-care practices, tips and tricks that you guys have been doing or have learned throughout the years that you wish you had been doing a long time ago or just started doing that is just kind of borne fruit. So Phil, why don't you kick us off and just kind of dive into this conversation?
Well, the first thing I want to say is, Andrew, thank you for helping guide the seminar here with Robi and I. Although I recognize that the main reason you decided you had to be on this webinar with us is because we're old guys. We'll start talking about something else, forget what we're talking about. What was the question anyway? I'm just kidding. No, this is a fun topic to talk about in terms of what did I learn and what have been some things that have had a huge impact in my life. And I'll just throw the easiest one out to right off the bat. And Robi, I'd be interested in your perspective on it. But I learned early to seek good counsel, to pursue good counsel, to chase it, to be open to it, because there was times in my life I was not open to good counsel. And when I came out of the woodshed, there was good counsel standing there waiting for me. I remember one of my mentors looking at me one day and saying, "How many times are you going to have to go to the woodshed?" And I'm like, "I don't want to go to the woodshed." But I kept learning to go to the woodshed. That's how I learned. But I got good counsel by seeking coaching and by seeking mentoring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with that. I think that there are times when I fought against that because I could be pretty independent, stubborn, some might say. But I can tell you the people that I sought out were people who were more spiritually in tune than I was. And that helped dramatically because I'm very practical. And I was like, if this is going to work, then I'm going to do it. And sometimes working in the kingdom of God, it's not always about practical. Sometimes it's about what God is leading you toward. And that requires faith. And so, early on, I sought out people, and there have been seasons when I've sought out people that were just spiritually in tune and would also speak into me and not be afraid to say, you need to listen to this.
But the part that we have to bring to the table is an openness to it, a willingness to actually listen. Because I know from a coaching perspective or a mentoring perspective with church planners, there have been a lot of church planners that I've been asked to coach, and they valued the coaching, but it annoyed them because there's a humility to being willing to listen to a strong voice. And sometimes you'll throw things past. And it's not that we're brilliant as coaches, but sometimes we have a perspective. We'll throw it past a church planner, and you can tell that they want the perspective, they value the perspective, but they really are annoyed that somebody else had to suggest the idea. They wanted to come up with it on their own, and that was me.
Yeah.
And I had to learn to value and to seek and to give voices an opportunity to actually have a strong voice in my life. So I had a professor from seminary. I don't know who comes to your mind, but one of my seminary professors called me once a month for 25 years. And, and then my dad, of course, had a strong voice in my life, and I had a good relationship with him. So that was very helpful. But I found that there were opportunities to have several people in my life who spoke in. And just a couple of years ago, I was searching for a couple new ones. I remember sitting down with one of my guys who's now mentoring me once a month and I said to him, all my mentors have died, and I had nothing to do with it, but all my mentors have passed away. And I'm accustomed to having somebody just go anywhere they want to go in a conversation with me. And so we've now started a pattern of talking at least once a month.
Yeah, that's really cool. Well, I would go back to what you said about some of the guys we coach, because I coach some guys within the Nexus system as well. And the whole attitude of being receptive and coachable is great because what we offer is a coaching environment. I remember thinking that when you all told me that I would have a coach when I planted our church. Of course, I was 54 years old and I had been in ministry for a long time, and my first thought was, why do I need a coach? I mean, I kind of know what I'm doing, but then I realized after going to some of the training that I had no clue what I was doing, and coaching was invaluable. And now as I pass that forward, as I coach other guys, wow, it's just so much fun if they're receptive. Sometimes it's just, there's a resistance to that. But like you said, man, it makes a huge difference.
How do you, what's the difference for you guys when you talk about through maybe even like paid seasons of like paying a coach for like some of the insights and stuff like that, and just guys that are just spiritually mature in your life that you just kind of reach out to regularly?
I would draw even a third distinction of just temporary, almost just serendipitous, God sent, just spirit led leaders. Because yeah, I've had paid coaches. I started paying a coach back in 1996 because I was planting my second church, and I knew by that point how barely we had survived our first church. So I wanted help. So I paid a guy to coach me, and then paid him to coach 2 of my staff members. And then I ended up finding a third guy who he came along and coached me even later. So there's paid coaching, and then there's regular coaching that sort of comes relationally. Like Spark, who's the director of operations for Nexus. When I first met him in Chicago, he was a businessman, and the 2 of us had breakfast on Monday mornings at the Liberty Restaurant for 10 years. And Spark earned the right to speak about anything he wanted to in my life. So there was, I had paid, I had volunteer people who were more than willing to just assert themselves into my life because I'd given them that. Plus, I returned the favor. I'm fairly assertive myself. But then there's occasional people that just sort of, I need to learn how to do something. And I won't say his name, but there was a large church pastor in Indianapolis that I called one time and just drove down and said, I called him ahead and said, could I have an hour of your time? And I just went down and unburdened all my complaints and frustrations about ministry on him. And he just kind of sat there and smiled and said, welcome to senior pastorhood. And then he gave me some feedback, and I never met with him again, but it was huge. It was a huge impact on me to help me see that. Robbie, do you see those distinctions?
Oh yeah, big time. I remember one time we were out in California, and we were supposed to be out there. There was a convention supposed to take place out there, and they didn't have enough people for it, but we'd already booked our flights and stuff. And so we took a week of our time and just went and visited different churches, kind of that seasonal thing. And I met with a guy who's passed away now. His name was Ron Carter, and he was preaching in Napa. And I'll never forget sitting down with him. And one of the things he said to me, which was so profound, was when you're in ministry, there are going to be some people that really like you and some people that really don't. And you just got to get used to that. And I was like, at that season in my life, I needed to hear that.
Yeah.
And God knew that. And that was one of those moments you just described where it's not like a long-term thing, but at that moment, that's what I needed to hear, because I was battling that, the desire to do what I wanted to do at the same time to please people. And that was a bad situation.
Well, my number one then is seek good counsel. Is Proverbs 4:7 is the beginning of wisdom is this, get it. Yeah. So the beginning of wisdom is want it. So put some strong voices in your life. Did I cut you off there, Andrew?
No, you're good. Yeah, I was going to say, so yeah, talking about strong voices, coaching and mentorship. What's the next one? Robbie, you got one?
Yeah, I think let me piggyback on a little bit what Phil said, because it's one of the things on my list that I want to talk about, and that is don't be afraid to actually go to counseling in regard to seek good counsel. I know that I was at different times in my life needed that, but was resistant to it. At the same time, there was a situation when I left the last church I was a part of that I needed to hear somebody tell me something. And so, I know that part of this is all about self-care and soul care and that kind of stuff. And I'll never forget the counselor saying to me, what do you do for self-care? And I said, I didn't know that was legal. And that was legitimately where I was at the time. And so I needed that counsel. So I would piggyback off that real quick. But, I would also say, in kind of another vein, one of the things it's so important to do is to read. I mean, to read. But I also think that reading good stuff, but also reading things that are outside the box reading, that are not necessarily traditional, just the latest church growth book or the latest this or that or whatever, but reading things from a business perspective, but also keeping in mind that the church is not completely a business, but reading different things, but then taking something out of that. I've been impressed with what Phil has done, and he'll probably talk about this. I'm not hoping I don't steal his thunder, but where he reads a book and then summarizes it and kind of keeps it together. I didn't do that early on. I do that now, but just taking some movement from that reading, because I've talked to a lot of guys who read a lot and get into stuff, but they don't do much with it. They're just more into the study of studying, and that's not necessarily the healthiest thing. But reading has been a huge thing for me. I read a book a number of years ago. Well, I read half a book, and then then I let it sit for like 3 or 4 years. And then when we were going through a particularly difficult time at a church where I was at, I started reading the other half of that book, and it dealt with an issue that I was dealing with in regard to this split that the church was going through at the time. And I had no idea. And it was just one of those moments where God just used that in an incredible way. And it doesn't happen unless you seek it out, so reading is so important.
I was challenged down the same lines by a couple of my mentors who challenged me to be a perpetual student, to just put myself into school. David Rokup, one of my mentors, his way of putting it is, you can either pay for books or you can be paying for a U-Haul as you move to your new ministry. You have to keep growing. I thought that was a rather stark statement, but I remember being young and not having a book allowance at my first church, and they weren't paying me, and we didn't have money, and I had no book allowance, and I must have made enough of a stink about the fact I didn't have a book allowance that one of the members of the church said they would take care of it, and it started out at $5 a week. And then it went to 10 because they realized I actually do read. And it got up to where I was getting $25 a week by the time I left the church plants that I was in Chicago. And at one point, I remember in an evening with the elders, I was complaining that I felt like I was going brain dead, and I wished I was back in school. I just kind of let that out. And one of my elders very compassionately said, "This is your problem, not ours." And I was like, well, but this is before the internet, and some of you can't remember this, but I called the seminary and I asked them what classes were being offered that semester, and they sent me a list. And this took a while because you're back and forth getting letters. And I then got a hold of the bookstore and said, if I were in these classes, what would be the textbooks? And they gave me like 8 or 9 books, and I ordered all of them, and I just put myself into class. Just started reading. And like you said, Robbie, put myself not just into the things I want to read, but make myself read kind of widely. And I very carefully put together a set of commentaries where I picked the best commentary on Colossians. I didn't buy a set of commentaries. I bought individual commentaries. And over time, I was able to put together a really nice collection of well done commentaries and reading. And yes, Fred Craddock, in his book on preaching, challenges all young leaders, particularly, and I think anyone watching this is probably in ministry, retain the fruit of your labor. So if you've decided to preach through the Sermon on the Mount and you read Martin Lloyd-Jones on the Sermon on the Mount, you should never have to pull Martin Lloyd-Jones off the shelf again just to look at it. You should have notes. And so I just started, and when I would read something worth reading and keeping, I started the pattern of putting together a series of notes. I would either just steal all the illustrations out of the book, like a Max Lucado book is always good for illustrations, or a Dallas Willard book is always good for thought-provoking thoughts. And I create my own little, in a sense, cheat sheet. And some of the church planners are now doing that too. And they're kind of pushing me and shaming me into sharing mine. I really haven't shared many of those, but I've probably got about 80 books that I've done that with. And at some point, I probably need to run through them and make them available to other guys. But it has helped me immensely to be writing sermons or even get called to teach a seminary course at grad school. And I'm looking at the textbooks that they're going to have to be reading. And it's like, I've read those and I've got my own notes. I don't have to go back and pull the book off the shelf. I've got my own notes. Deep work, committing yourself to deep work, committing yourself to the hard chair work of having something worth saying. Not that you're necessarily going to say it well, but at least you've thought it through. I think that's one of the things I learned early on that has tremendously benefited me even now as I get invited to go speak on topics, and I can go pull books that I've read and I've got my summarized notes down. It's so much better that way. Maybe I'm a bit of a geek. Maybe I became a geek when I was a kid. Book geek.
I hesitate to comment. We're all geeks at some level.
Yeah.
No, that's good stuff. Yeah, I love the quote that the leaders are learners, and just the idea of just continuing to grow and to understand and just to stretch yourself and always be moving in that direction, because there's not, and it doesn't even just have to be books. I mean, there's so many millions of of ways that we can
Podcast
content
now.
these days, you know.
Audible books. Awesome. Dallas Willard put it this way. I ran into a quote. He threw it out. He was talking about himself, but he had resolved to never seek to have a place to preach. Instead, he would seek to have something worth saying. And I just, that again resonates with me. I wish I would have found that when I was younger. I only found that just in the last year. But don't be all upset and obsessed with finding a place to preach. Put some focus on having something worth saying when the opportunity comes. And I think that posture puts you into a perpetual learning mode.
Well, and I think keeping track of what you're learning, like you do with the books, like one of the things I know I've told you that when I go to a seminar, we have a Think Next, seminar thing through Nexus, I take a lot of notes, but then I also, when I'm taking notes, I'll write down action steps. And like the last one we were at, I had like 20 some action steps. Of course, I can't do all 20 of those things, but I've written them down. And so then before I close that note out, I take some time and I whittle that down to the top 2 or 3, and then I highlight those. And then those are things that I integrate into my regular schedule, whether it's a simple one item thing to do, or whether it's an ongoing different practice that I want to apply. That's what I do. And that has helped me a bunch. Phil, you and I were talking about this the other day. I don't know how people go to conferences or seminars and not take notes and remember anything. It just blows my mind. I can't. I mean, maybe it's because I'm old, I don't know, but I've got all kinds of notes from all the different things that I've done, and I go back through those on occasion. When I do like an annual review of my life, I'll go back through some of those things, and I'll look and go, okay. And sometimes it's a measurement, so you got to be careful that you don't just go, well, I never did anything with that. Well, but what about the things you did do? You got to remember those things as well.
I think learning how to manipulate Evernote. I think, Frank, learning how to use Evernote and manipulate Evernote, or maybe OneNote. I've never messed with OneNote, but Evernote, I think, frankly, screw Greek and Hebrew, drop them. Learn how to use Evernote. That's actually practical. You put stuff in Evernote and you'll have it there forever. That's why they call it Evernote. And so here's sermon illustrations or quotes or an idea or a take on Colossians chapter 3, and you just throw it in there and it's easy to find. And Greek, somebody else will do the Greek for you. So,
I feel like I'm hearing Kenny Bowles from like Ozark just telling me like blasphemy right now. So
well, I'm a pragmatist. I'll tell you another thing I do, and I admit that by saying this online and putting this into a webinar, I'm admitting that there's some OCD to me. I know there's a little bit of obsessive compulsive disorder, which led to me taking notes on books. But I dove into the Psalms years ago. I committed myself to a year of following a thing called A Guide to Prayer by a guy named Reuben Job and Shawcheck. And this thing had a guide for plans for prayer for every week of the year. And I committed myself to it because it had quotes from different leaders throughout church history. And I thought that'd be interesting. The part that really snagged me was the part I was least interested in. It was basically, you had to commit yourself to reading one psalm, 7 days for that week. You're going to read that psalm for 7 days. And I grew up in a part of the country where boys were not encouraged to learn poetry. Robbie, I think you grew up in the same zone. So the idea of reading poetry, psalm, they had nothing at all interesting to me. But I started falling in love with the Psalms over time, to the point that I finally just decided, and it took me years, but I decided to study each of the Psalms to the point I can give each of the Psalms their own title. So rather than Psalm 13, which says nothing to me, Psalm 13 is waiting on God rather than forcing my own answer. It's just each of the Psalms became a title for me. And I think the commitment to the Psalms, because I don't think I could not have learned to pray. And I'm not saying I pray well, but I could not have learned to pray as I do had I not committed myself to letting the Psalms teach me to pray, which I think is what they're for. The Psalms, Peterson would say, are actually not the word of God. They're more technically, the Psalms are God's words to us to use when we talk back to him. So they're words from God for us to use. And I think I'm bothered by the way we've discovered of how to be a follower of Christ. We just don't follow him into the prayers he prayed. And so I think the Psalms have become for me, I wish I would have jumped into them even earlier.
Good stuff. So we talk a lot about just finding voices to speak into your life, being very intentional about of reading and retaining a lot of information, continuing to grow as a leader. What's something else, Phil, for you that you have?
You'll like this one because I know you do the Clarity Project, which is kind of hosted by Nexus, and it's a ministry you do on your own, Andrew. And it's basically how to articulate a vision frame and how to articulate a God dream. But on a personal level, there's a book out called Unique, and I was doing this way before the book came out. I was just doing it through other people, but learning to articulate a sense of life mission. And so I was 30 years old, and Spark, who I mentioned earlier that I had breakfast with once a week, the two of us, for whatever reason, we're about the same age. We decided we needed to articulate a life mission statement. I won't tell you what my initial life mission statement was because it was a little selfish, self-centered, and self-oriented. But over time, I've discovered that having a dynamic in the sense of changing, evolving, moldable sense of mission has helped me immensely. Different phases in my life, I find myself having to make some tough decisions, and it's been very helpful to me to have articulated, here's a sense of mission, here's a sense of values, these are some objectives I'm trying to accomplish. And just the further and further I clarify that. And now that I'm past 60 years old, I find myself even more interested in my life mission because I have fewer years to get there. And so becoming more and more focused. And so I found that it's extremely helpful to me to have articulated a sense of mission and to keep a dashboard in a sense. And again, in my Evernote, I go there in the morning. Here's my dashboard. It's one of the first things that will pop up in my Evernote. And it tells me, again, here's my sense of mission that I feel like I'm called to try to accomplish during this life. And then not only here's my sense of mission, but here's the core values that are driving us and the things that are pushing us forward. And I would throw it out there that if somebody were watching this webinar and they're interested in working on a sense of life mission, holler at us. I'd be happy to chat with you about my own personal experience of pursuing it. Andrew's got more actual training on how to actually guide somebody through that than I do. But the value of having your sense of clarity articulated has been so helpful for me to face tough decisions. Because one of my mentors used to say, you have to understand what's your sense of mission. Okay, what's your current set of skills, gifts, and abilities you really want to use most? And then what's the best platform? And too many people jump for a platform without thinking through what is it they're trying to accomplish. So it's just, I would advocate anybody and everybody, if you're leading a ministry, you're expected to have vision. Well, how can you have vision for your church if you don't have vision for yourself? That'd be my question.
That's good.
I was at conference time when I was a youth minister, and I think it was a CIY youth conference, and Rich Mullins was actually there doing a.
Rich Mullins, is that what you said?
Yeah, oddly enough, Rich Mullins. Yeah, he talked about the importance of having hobbies, and I thought about it, and through the years, that's really been a good place for me to go, because so he walked into what you're doing. He said you need to have some things that you can measure, because sometimes ministry is hard to measure. And then he also talked about it's just good. Like I used it. One of the things he talked about is as a tool to reach and connect to people. Like I used to play a lot of golf, so I would connect to people that way. And now I ride a bike a lot. And so it's a good connection as well as good exercise, and, just get you away from all the other stuff. Sometimes you just need that break.
What's next for you, Phil?
I think it's maybe my last one to throw out there. The one that's on my mind, if something else comes up, it'll just be an accident, is I've worked very hard, started working hard years ago on trying to find ways to stay spiritually fresh and look for more and more and more ways. And again, part of it is, I don't know if I'm OCD, but my wife tells me that I am ADD. I don't have the H, but I got the D. And so I have a very difficult time doing repetitive behavior. And so I have learned over the years that if I'm going to stay spiritually fresh, I've got to have a fairly large repertoire of ideas that can work on Monday. And then Tuesday, I want something else. Then Wednesday, I want something else. And that doesn't mean that there's no consistency. But over the years, I've discovered that the larger I can grow my repertoire of ideas, in a sense, I can open up my backpack for spirituality today, have a quiet time, and what am I going to do today? And if I don't have very many options, I'm in trouble because I'll quit. It's like I like oatmeal, But if you fed me oatmeal 30 straight days, I'm going to quit liking oatmeal. And same things with Egg Benedict. I like Eggs Benedict, but if you give it to me for 30 straight days, I'm done. Well, and that's where I think a lot of people settle in on spiritual formation techniques, and they don't have enough of a repertoire to keep it live, to keep it fresh. I was chewing on some of the things that I've done in the past. I used the ACTS formula as I was journaling. I kind of picked that up from Bill Hybels out of one of his books. I did the Jesus prayer, which is the Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior, have mercy on me. I experimented with the idea of creating an inner room, which the Eastern Orthodox refer to as kind of the pustina. There's even a kind of a weird thing there, but you just sort of imagine yourself in a room waiting for Jesus to show up. I did the 1 year Bible. I can't tell you how many times, different translations. I even did the 1 year chronological Bible over the years. At least twice I've gone through that. And then I did the Guide to Prayer I mentioned earlier, which put me into the Psalms. Found out there were 3 volumes of the Guide to Prayer. So that's 3 separate years, not in a row. That would have been boring, but I mixed it up. And then I found spiritual readings of just different people like Richard Foster, Eugene Peterson, Dallas Willard, A.W. Tozer, Thomas A. Kempis, Francis de Sale, Frank Laubach. I just found myself reading all kinds of books, put myself into life transformation groups. So I found myself for 10 years meeting with Spark while I was in Chicago, but everywhere I've moved, I found myself getting into an accountability group. I just was in a group this morning, 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock at a restaurant. And then I journal, not consistently, but occasionally. It really helps me to grab my journal and journal, or just engaging in deep friendship. And then, of course, I went to the Psalms and took the time to study through all of those. And then I started trying to memorize a few of those, but at a certain point that gets a little heavy, and I haven't really kept that up. But I do read through the Psalms. Barb and I just this year committed ourselves to doing the Book of Common Prayer, praying through the Book of Common Prayer, which I probably watched 6 YouTube videos on how to do it before I finally figured out a cheat. And there's a thing called cradleofprayer.com where they actually do the Book of Common Prayer vocally, and you can just listen along. So doing that, I was able to get my Book of Common Prayer out and figure out how many pages I had to turn to, because you have to have like 6 ribbons to turn all back and forth. I mean, you got to be brilliant to figure out how to do that. But right now we're doing it, and I'm 2 months in. We'll find out whether I like it 10 months from now, but Barb and I committed we're going to do this for a year. And it's something we can do in the morning, and we can turn it on and listen to it, and then we can do it in the evening. But my point is, I think we need to create a menu. We want to create a menu for ourselves of a variety of things. And I'm so glad that years ago I started just experimenting with this and experimenting with this, because I listen to people and they don't have a deep spiritual life. And I'm not saying I do. I'm just saying I at least have a varied spiritual life. I'm not stuck with oatmeal every day, because I'll just quit if that's where I'm at.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is right, Phil. It's about movement, and sometimes we lock ourselves into there's only a certain way we're supposed to approach God or have our quiet time, and really don't even like that expression, quiet time, all that much. And we get locked into that. I know for me, I've had seasons where I have written out my prayers, and man, that has been so good, and I write a letter to God. And then I've also had seasons where I go back to that and look at what I was writing about. And I see some of the victories, some of the things I'm still struggling with in different areas, but also how God has been faithful. And it just motivates me to continue. And so that's been one of the tools that I've been able to use, as well as so many others like you talked about. And there's, certain devotional books are really, really good. There's one that my wife and I read now called New Morning Mercies by Paul David Tripp. And we read it together, and it's good. And this is our 2nd year to read through it. And so yeah, it's a good tool that I use as well. I would also, since I'm still alive here and you can see me, I would say this on another subject is one of the things I see guys struggling with in ministry is not taking their day off. I just think it's so incredibly important to do that. It's hard sometimes, but it's important for your own spiritual health. It's also important to incorporate a bit of Sabbath into your weekly schedule, which is not always easy, but just taking your day off. So many guys don't take their day off. And as a result of that, their families suffer. They suffer from burnout. They're just not taking care of themselves. That's the way God designed us. And during that day off time, sometimes it's like, okay, I'm, I've got all this work that I do at work, and now I'm going to do all this work at home. And even that isn't really taking a day off. And so I think strategically, intentionally planning what to do when your off time is legitimately off. Sometimes it means just being quiet. Sometimes it means reading a book. Sometimes it means going for a walk, or in my case, I like to go for a bike ride. And so go someplace and do that, or spend time with your spouse or your family, just to take some time away. Do something that energizes you. I mean, it's so easy to get so locked in, and you just lose perspective so quickly. So I learned that early on, to take my day off. And I had a minister when I was a youth minister that was my boss, that he was rigid about it. And I really appreciated that about him. It just helped.
I would say that the topic of this conversation is, what are we glad we learned to do when we were younger? I'll admit, one of the things I wish I would have learned to do when I was younger was have hobbies, because I have to make myself, I love what I do, but I have to train, I have to discipline myself to take time off. And so, yeah, I wish I was better at that.
Well, I get it. I'm ADD too. I mean, and as a result of that, I can fixate on one particular thing. And even though I have a bunch of different things going at the same time, there's some energy in that. And the work sometimes becomes the hobby. And that's where it gets a little dangerous sometimes. I think, and also another, I think probably the last thing that I have that's of any significance is, I've seen through the years, and I was counseled about this early on, to not use the office, like the church office, as a place of escape. But I saw too many times myself sometimes, and then other people would do that. And instead of actually functionally connecting to people, it became, if I show up at the office at X time and leave at X time, then I've done my job. And that's not really what ministry is. And so sometimes ministers struggle, myself included, struggle with connecting to our neighbors, because we're thinking we're doing all of these things that are ministry. I don't need to take the time to connect to my neighbors. But one of the things I've learned is that I need to get out, and I need to get to know people in my community. Planting a church is a huge help in that area, because you have to. You're not gonna make it if you don't. But just and having in a sense, there's a book I read a number of years ago about the third place, that everybody has their first place, which is their home. Second place is work, and third place is that other place they go to. And sometimes it's a hobby, sometimes it's for some people it could be the bar, for whatever. But we all have a third place typically where we land, and that's where people are, and that's where we need to go to connect to them as well. And so getting out of the office requires that.
All right. Andrew, I do have one more thing to throw out there before we wrap up. I wish I would have gotten a hold of this earlier. And all these things we've been talking about are not things that we've attained. I think, Robbie, you'd agree with me. These are things we're aspiring to. I've started to learn new things. Wish I would have learned some of them earlier. Here's one I wish I would have found earlier. We got involved a couple of years ago in a thing called Bonhoeffer Project. Robbie, you've been through that. Andrew, I think you have too. I did it in 2019, and then we had 2 cohorts go through it through Nexus in 2020, and then another set of cohorts in 21 and 22. And we're gearing up right now for 23. And this is a 10-month cohort experience where you study the process of what is a disciple and how are we going to make disciples, or how am I going to be making disciples. And it's just been such a blessing to my personal life, and my blessing to my ministry, and blessing not only to Nexus as my ministry, but the church I was involved in, to be able to actually stop and think it through in a cohort experience, sort of a competitive experience, because you get a group together and we're sharing our ideas with one another. Well, we're stealing ideas from one another actively. But the Bonhoeffer process has been such a blessing to me. I'll throw that out for the two of you, but I wish I would have found that 30 years ago.
Yeah, it was really, really good for me. It was challenging. It was challenging in ways I felt like I was back in school. And some of that I was like, okay, this is hard. But at the same time, man, there's some things about the gospel and some things about what making disciples is all about that I hadn't even crossed my mind.
Yeah, I was embarrassed as to it was embarrassing to be as old as I was going through it and realize I didn't know this. And I've been in ministry all these years.
Yeah, I know. It felt pretty intimidating. It was like, oh, you mean I've been doing this wrong all this time?
Yeah, mulligan. I get it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing too. It's like, it goes back to what you said earlier. Be lifelong learners. I mean, Andrew, you said that. And it's just so important.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's good stuff. I think, the other thing maybe that I'm learning about you guys is that you can tell a lot about a person by the background on their Zoom calls. And I just see Mr. Potato Head right now. So on Robbie's screen.
That's because I have 3 granddaughters, and all 3 of them were here all last week, 2 of them from New York, and they played with a lot of toys. And so they were playing with Mr. Potato Head.
There you go.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good stuff.
Yeah.
Well, is there any last thoughts that you guys have? Just things. I mean, we could probably talk for all day and just go on so many different topics and conversations. But any last thoughts?
I would go to Proverbs 4:7 again. The beginning of wisdom is this: get it, pursue it, chase it down, tie it, rope it, catch it, cage it, keep it. Though it cost you all you have, get understanding. Proverbs chapter 4 verse 7. I think the desire for it, like I said, I don't claim to have attained any of the things we've talked about. I would claim I can fully testify to myself here. I do claim that I aspire to knowing how to do these things. And so everything that I'm talking about here, and I think Robbie, you'd say the same thing. We haven't got it down, but I'm glad I started doing some of these things 30 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would jump on that too and follow up with James 1, which says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously to all without finding fault. Because sometimes we say, well, we want wisdom. Well, we need God in that process, not just us thinking we've got it all figured out. So yeah. And aspire is the right word for sure, because it's not been mastered yet.
Yeah, put our webpage on this, Andrew, and or put info at Nexus for somebody if they want to reach out to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've been grateful, guys, for not for just for this time, but just to have a couple more mature gentlemen in my own life to be able to reach out to and to continue to have conversations with. So thank you guys for your time.
All right.
You bet, man. It's great. Thank you.